Abel and how Cain had killed his brother. So that was the first family we talked about. Then we came a few weeks. Next week we talked about Noah, and of course by that time there'd been several generations upon the earth, and people were wicked. So God chose to flood the earth and sort of start all over again with Noah and his family, his 3 sons and their wives, and his wife there. So then we moved on into Abraham and Sarah. And we talked about Abraham, the faith of Abraham. Abraham left his homeland there, and God had made promises to Abraham. He promised him that, Abraham, of course, was a man of faith. He promised him, a great nation. He promised him land that he would never actually own or possess, but his family, his descendants would. He also promised him a blessing, and also said that all nations upon the earth would be blessed through his seed, Isaac, which was his son. And last week we talked about Isaac and Rebekah, and Abraham he sent to find a wife for his son Isaac. That was through the seed, the Israelite nation, because God had also he's starting to reveal his redemptive plan for mankind here, as opposed to destroying them again, and. So we said they went and found a wife for Isaac, and we read the story about Jacob and Esau and how Jacob stole his birthright. So you would think this week we would jump into Jacob and his family, but we don't. We that is not. So basically the last 22 chapters of Genesis, we skip over the family of Jacob, which is fairly important there. And of course we're not going to get into that. But, that's the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel, and sort of skipped over that. And so this week we're going to be jumping into the first of Exodus, and we'll start with Moses. And again, things move fairly rapidly here. Pretty much there's a transition from Old Testament to New Testament about 400 years. I'm not Old Testament, New Testament. From Genesis to Exodus, about 400 years there, and starting out in Exodus, so we'll get to that here in just a moment. But anyway, before we get started, Keith spoke to me before he left. He said that Fran's got some problems with her stomach, and she's supposed to see a PT tomorrow. Then also on Wednesday she's supposed to see her pain doctor. So he had to leave and go take care of her. So remember Keith and Fran. Also to continue to remember Jacques Peak there, and the loss of his father, passed away, and they had their services here at the church yesterday, so continue to remember that family. And again, Shannon, I guess he's getting ready to have surgery in this week. Just go to the doctor tomorrow. But also, who else we need to mention? May have any overlook anyone, but okay. Oh yeah, John Jackson. Sue Jackson passed away. That was John and Tiffany. Tiffany lost her mom about this time last year, and John lost his mother yesterday. I mean, they buried her yesterday, so remember that family also. Oh, Sue Jackson. Yeah, Sue, John's mother. Okay, great.
Bow with me, please. Most kind and gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this beautiful day that you've given us and all your many blessings. We're so thankful, Lord, for everything you've blessed us with. We pray for all those families who've lost loved ones recently. We pray that you'll be with them and that you'll comfort them as only you can. We pray, Lord, as we go throughout this study that we'll gain knowledge and we'll use it in our everyday life. Thank you for allowing us to gather here together and worship you. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, I'm going to start in Exodus 1, verses 8 through 20. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of a war that they also join enemies and fight against us. So go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, and in manner of services in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mightily. Exodus 2, verses 1 through 10. And a man of the house of Levi went and took as a wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, but put the child in it and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar and to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, Because I drew him out of the water. Hebrews 11:23 through 25. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin.
Thanks, Drake. Quick question. When y'all looked at the name of this lesson, how many knew who Amram and Jochebed were? Anybody? Oh, yeah. I did, yeah. That's you. I mean, again, of course, I guess it's a good trivia question. It's something, Bible Bowl question. And one of those, I remember when I looked at it, of course, I'm sure I've heard this name several times. And probably if you'd ever watched the Moses and the Ten Commandments and all that, I do remember seeing the part with Moses being in the river there. And again, as far as those names, like I said, when I first saw that, I thought, who are these people we're studying this week? And then, and it's interesting too that they're not mentioned here in this account in our lesson today, even though we're talking about Amram and Jochebed. You see their names mentioned there over in Exodus 6:20. And you also see their names mentioned again in Numbers 26:59. But as far as in this passage today, we don't see it. And it's interesting too, because Moses, he was the writer here, and he wrote this, and yet he for some reason or other, he chose not to, include his parents' name here in this writing. He also chose not to even include his name. We talked about there in verse 1 about the baby being born to them. So, thought that was interesting. Also, too, when we read there a while ago, I'm not sure why, but it stopped at verse 20, what Trey read there in the first part there. In verse 21, which is very important to our lesson, and it said, verse 20 said, so God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. Verse 21 says, which we're not reading in our text, it says, and because the midwives feared God, God gave them families of their own. And verse 22 says, and Pharaoh gave his order to all the people, throw every newborn Hebrew into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live. So again, I don't know why they didn't include that in the reading, because that's a pretty important part of our text today. But anyway. So again, we'll go ahead and get started here in the lesson of the questions. And again, feel free to speak up, and so I hope there's some good commentary here today. Question number 1: why is Egypt called the gift of the Nile? And I think pretty much what they're talking about here is the gift of Nile. What we think about Egypt, we think about what? Desert. The desert. We see the Sphinx there, the pyramids, just a dry, desolate land there. But the Nile River is basically what allows that country to flourish and to exist. Its existence depends upon the Nile, and it's been its lifeline for several, thousands and thousands of years. The Nile River has Egypt. Without the Nile River, it wouldn't be the nation it is today. And also, too, I think the book talked about most of the people. Where do they live? They live within close proximity in that area. They live close to the Nile River there. Question number 2: what made the Nile Delta so fertile? We started talking about the flooding and all the farming. I thought, man, this is a lesson out. I should have done me to spend some time on this part. But yeah, like you said there, the flooding there. Where Egypt is at there is called Lower Egypt, and even though it's to the north, and Upper Egypt is to the south. I guess it's sort of like when we talked about Jerusalem at one time. Jerusalem, you go up to Jerusalem. So I say it's sort of the same verbiage. Correct, yeah. Because the southern part of Egypt is higher, so it flows from the mountains there, it said. Yeah. Yeah. It's the way they do it, but again, I guess is the way they do the upper and lower, all that stuff is just because of, I guess because the lower Egypt is there, even though it's the northern part, it's at sea level. Whereas Upper Egypt is to the south, but yet it's probably at a higher elevation. But yeah, I was talking about there before, the rains. They had these, I guess in Ethiopia, there in Africa, they had these, every year you can pretty much rely on these monsoon rains that happened in that area. And what happens is, like I said, it just pushes all that water there from a higher area to a lower area, and it takes that silt, it takes that dirt with it, it takes that topsoil. And I read somewhere too, that the topsoil there can be as high as 70 feet. That's a lot of fertile topsoil, and you see pictures of it too. When you do these lessons, you go back and you look there beside where it floods every year. It's just like right there close to the Nile. It's a mess, that just real deep. But it is all that stuff is brought in there. It's sort of but again, it's a area very, very, very rich in soil and also too, where the Egypt is there too, is that's the Nile Delta, and that's sort of the very where it's entering into the Mediterranean Sea there, so it spreads out. It's not just a small area there along the Nile, it spreads out. So it's about 100 miles wide and about 150 miles long there. So you got a pretty good area there of fertile land. Question number 3. How did the Nile help Egypt survive famine?
From the irrigation and the water, they were able to grow crops in other places work in the grass.
Right. Pretty much, yeah. But we're on page, sometimes the book answers these questions, of course, so I better not do it. It's that second paragraph there on page 36. It's 36. It says, Egypt's advantage in the world of the patriarchs was that it did not depend on rain for productive lands. The Nile provided the water, which is a series of dikes and canals directed into hot, dry fields. The disadvantage was that the people of Canaan and elsewhere in the Near East often turned to Egypt when famine struck. Egypt had grain when scarcity became widespread. When Abraham and Sarah went to Egypt, they followed the thousands of thousands who had gone before them. Native Egyptians referred to the people from their east as Hebrews, for they had no city of nationality. So again, we see that during the time of also, this is during the time of Abraham. When Abraham went first, he was the first person who went there. Then, of course, Jacob, he took all his sons there to buy food from Joseph, unknowingly, during the famine there also. So during that period of time, a lot of people would travel to Egypt. That was sort of the lifeline of a lot of people during the famines and stuff, because, again, they just had so much, of course, during Joseph's time, it was because Joseph saved up 7 years of plenty. When the 7 years of bountiful harvest, they saved and stored the grains there, but still, they were able to produce a lot of food in that area. And again, when it came to droughts and stuff like that, they're more prone to be able to survive those. Okay, question number 4. Why did Pharaoh want to kill Hebrew baby boys? What's that?
The Israelites were mighty, they were
Yes.
strong.
The Israelites were mighty and strong. Yeah, they were growing there. Verse 8, it says, talked about there was a new king. First of all, what happened? When if we looked there from Genesis there to Exodus, we saw a period of about 400 years that we're missing there. Okay, and what happened is, Joseph's brothers, they all settled there. They all passed away. But Joseph was second in command there in Egypt. But it said what happened after 400 years? Well, not 400 years, but it wasn't 400 years yet at the time when they left. But basically, they had forgotten Joseph. They'd forgotten all the good things about Joseph. They had new kings. Of course, over a period of 400 years, or new pharaohs. That relationship that Joseph and the people there had with the Pharaoh during Joseph's time was gone. And so, therefore, they saw them more as a threat than as the reason they were brought there in the first place was for Joseph. But yeah, they were afraid there also too. It says there in the book or the Bible there that says that they were afraid that it would grow and they might, as they grew, that they might actually decide to rebel and maybe join forces with some of Egypt's enemies and overthrow the Egyptians there. So that was the purpose of them wanting to kill, because like I said, they were just growing. Like I said, everywhere you went, there's Egyptians. I'm not Egyptians, but they're Hebrews or Israelites there. So again, they were becoming too numerous. So they wanted to kill the baby boys. But what was the other choices he had before that? What did the king try to do before he got to that point? What was his first mode of action? Worked them hard, yeah. He worked them from, I'm assuming from daylight to dark every day, 7 days a week, and thought two things either happened. Either kill them all. I mean, you would overwork them where it would kill them, or two, it would probably decrease the birth rate. Because, if you worked 12, 14, 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, probably the birth rate may go down. But what happened instead? It increased. It went the opposite direction. So, again, that plan didn't work. So, and again, it skipped over the second plan he had, and that's when he talked to the midwives. He had the Hebrew midwives. He talked to them, or he talked to them. He brought them before them. What did he tell the Hebrew midwives to do? Kill them. Yeah, he basically abortion outside the womb. You know, it's basically, you know, infanticide or whatever. You know, once the baby is born, dispose of the baby. And did the midwives obey him? No. And that's where again, the midwives, that's something too. You know, that was a direct order from the king, or not from the king, from the Pharaoh. And of course, you know, the Bible tells us too, in Romans it tells us to obey our authorities. But again, this is a case where, you know, God's, it's in contradiction. You know, this is in direct contradiction to God's law, you know, and God's law would not allow that. And, you know, where else in the Bible do we see instances of people basically disobeying the government, civil disobedience? The Old Testament. Esther, Daniel, yeah. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, yeah. We see the apostles there too. Many times they went to cities and they were supposed to they preached the gospel and they said that, you know, basically they said we must obey God rather than men. So, you know, there's, you know, people think, well, you know, some people may have a problem with this. Say, well, they disobeyed God because they're in Romans. It tells Paul tells the people to obey your rulers and stuff. But again, civil disobedience is something that we are not supposed to participate in. But when it comes in contradiction to God's law wins out every time, and that's something that even in today's world, you know, thankfully I can't think of any decrees that have come down from the government yet that would, maybe you could think of some, I don't know, but that would, that we'd have to obey. We may not like some things out there, but it's not something that we'd have to, it comes to a point where we actually have to make a choice, I should say, ourselves. Okay, any comments so far? Question number 5, who were Amram and Jochebed? Yeah, Moses' parents there, yeah. And of course, again, actually, we talked about that. You know, it doesn't even mention it until over at Exodus 6. But how were they related to each other? Same Levites, same tribes, and what else? Is his aunt? Yeah, yeah. Moses' father married his aunt, which, again, during that period of time was, I guess, a common thing. But but again, it was something that that was it. But they were from the tribe of Levi. Both of Moses' parents were. Question number 6. What did Jochebed do to save Moses? Yeah, she made an ark and hid him. And again, you know, the rule there was, what was the decree there? It was basically when a baby was born, what were you supposed to do with it? Kill it, yeah. Throw it in the Nile River. And so she chose not to do that. She hid him. How long did it say she hid him for? 3 months. And then why do you think she decided it's time to let him go? Yeah, exactly right. You know, it's hard to hide a baby forever, you know. And there's a point in time that you can't just, you know, keep him in your home there. So, again, she made the, you know, she made the ark, I say an ark, you know, that's what they actually call it, but, you know, she tells how she did it and made the basket there and sort of waterproofed it. And you know, we'll get to that here in just a minute. You know, must have faith there, you know, what God would do, because, you know, when you put that baby there in the Nile River, you know, there's a lot of things that could happen. But again, you know, she, I think it was more than faith and just not having any other options. But we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Yeah. Right.
And they actually call it an ark.
The water represents no situation. I mean, everybody in the water go all the time, and those babies all died. You know, and the water saved him, saved Moses. The same way with the ark there. And of course, when we were baptized, what does it do? You're washing away. You know, you're getting rid of your old body. You know, or getting rid of your sins, or your old man dies, new man arises. You know, type of thing. So. Yeah, there's a lot of analogies there to that, and but that is very interesting. Question number, what was it? 6? Yeah, 7. Who found Moses in the river? Yeah, daughter of Pharaoh. In verse 5, it said, in chapter 2 there, Trey read, said, said, so Pharaoh's daughter came down to the bathing of the river, and her attendants walked along the river banks. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maids to get it. When the princess opened it, she saw the little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for the Hebrew. Felt sorry for him, and she said, this must be one of the Hebrew children. But, so, it's interesting there when she found him, what did she do? She felt sorry, just like, again here, we'll talk about it here in just a minute, but, that's, there was a decree out there. Any baby born was supposed to be killed there. And so of all the people to find him, it was, Moses' daughter there, and whether that was providential or not, we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But what was interesting too about how was Moses raised there for his first few years of his life? By his own mother, yeah. And that was, and what else not only did she nurse him, but what else she got what? She got paid to do it, yeah. So it worked out well for them too there. But again, he got to be with them, and I think the point too here, probably when you read the scriptures there, most people who read this feel like the princess knew that was his mother, and so basically, Moses, it wasn't because she was fooled, or but it was more or less God's hand at work here. It wasn't because she was fooled. She knew more than likely this was Moses' true mother. Maybe they had that conversation. Who knows? But again, of course, too, there's also a lot they call like a wet mother. She was able to nurse him. But I'm sure there was a lot of other people there in that area there too at that time that could have nursed him, unfortunately, because their children didn't make it. So there was a lot of mothers there that could have been there that could have done that for them. Hebrew women. Question number 8. What role did Miriam play in Moses' early life? She protected him, yeah. And I know next week our lesson is about Moses, Miriam, and Aaron, so hopefully there's a lot more, we'll get into a lot more next week. But at this part right here, we just see that, she followed him along the river banks there. And she also approached the princess there and asked the princess if she said, do you want me to go find someone to nurse him amongst the Hebrew women? And went and got her own mother. And the book also suggests too that she might have taken Moses back and forth between his mother and the princess there, maybe those years, or maybe even later on in life. Who knows? But again, I don't know if we'll find out more about that next week. But again, they did have she was very important there in the early part of Moses' life. Question number 9. What does the name Moses mean in Egyptian? Yeah. It says, I think it's born of, beloved of, born out of, drawn out of. Pharaoh's daughter rescued him from the water. And so also too foreshadows Moses. What did he? Later on he helped the Israelites out of the land of Egypt there. So he helped draw them out of there. And also too, we don't see it here. Moses wrote. I'm sure Moses, and maybe he hadn't, but when he was born, he probably had a different name, a Hebrew name. This name he has here is an Egyptian name. But again, he probably had a different name there when he was first born. And question number 10. What did Moses choose as his identity, Hebrew or Egyptian? Hebrew, yeah. It said there in Hebrew, we read the text there, it said, by faith, what was it, 11:24, it said, by faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And we too hear, Moses, when he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter, he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. So he had all the luxuries. He had all the benefits of being a king, of a prince. He was, because it said there that she took him as her own son once, so he was raised up as a Egyptian. And we didn't see this, but when he goes down into to Midian, we didn't read this in chapter 2 there, but when he was at the well there in, what was the guy's name? His father-in-law's, anyway, when he asked him, he said, they came back to their father when he rescued, when he helped the 12 girls or his daughters there. I say 12 or 7, whatever it was. Anyway, Zipporah. What was their names? But anyway, Laban, I guess Zipporah, yeah. But what was her dad's name? Yeah, Jezebel. Okay, that's what it was. Anyway, he came back and he said, they said the Egyptian helped us. They mentioned him as an Egyptian. So he was, a lot of people, even though he was a Hebrew, he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. So he pretty much had, a lot of people in that area, he appeared as Egyptian even though he was a Hebrew by genealogy. Okay, we'll come back to that in just a minute. Now, question number 1, get to the discussion questions here. What can we learn from the courage and faith of Amram and Jochebed? I read this too, and sometimes you wonder about the book goes on and talks about their faith, and it does say there in Hebrews 11:23, it said, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they thought he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. So they hid him there. You think about, I guess in our times, you think about disobeying the government or something, in that situation. They may come to your house, you may get arrested, but you may go to court, get you a good lawyer, and get off. But that's not probably what would happen in that day and time. Pharaoh, he was and you think about too, if they came in, they did catch them in the house. The worst situation would they be able to they would just kill Moses and it would be over with. But that's probably not what would happen. It would probably, since Pharaoh, he was considered, a divine king. There were certain punishments there, and they could have gotten off easy, by being publicly flogged, but that's probably wasn't going to happen there. They also had different ways of punishing them. They could actually cut your hand off, cut your ear off, cut your nose off, disfigure you, basically brains you for the rest of your life and walk around. But most likely, you've been killed, and whether they killed you was different ways, not by lethal injection, or it's pretty much either by they would burn you, decapitate you, drown you. I'm sure you didn't get just dunked once. You probably went back and forth, and made it, miserable for you. And then, or an impalement, and we saw that back when Haman, during Esther and stuff, we talked about a while ago, an impalement. They basically took a pole and they put you up on the pole, and the pole went up through you. So there's no easy way to, anything. And what would happen to that wouldn't just happen to the parents; it would probably happen to all their children too. So again, it was something that the whole family were at risk for by going out and keeping him to this point. And also, too, it doesn't really point out in the book a lot, too, but the midwives, when they went back and they said that they were having babies faster than they can get there, do you think the king actually believed that, Pharaoh, or did he probably think, no, that's probably not? That might have been hard to swallow. But that showed their faith there, too, those midwives, because it said they feared God and they did what God had told them to do. They obeyed God rather than obeying man. And it said there, too, that they were blessed. They had their own families there. And I think it's also, too, interesting, of all the people mentioned in the first 10 verses of chapter 1 and chapter 2, the only people we see mentioned are the 2 midwives' names. You don't see anybody else's names mentioned. So those ladies, for what they did, their names have been honored throughout history. It's because of, them obeying God there and fearing God. But, you know, it showed there, but it talked about Abram and Jochebed. They feared God more than they feared man. They feared God more than they feared, and when we say feared God, that doesn't mean we have a fear for God. We have a respect for God. We respect what He tells us to do, so they trusted in God during this time. Question number 2: how did Moses' dual identity as both a Hebrew and a member of Pharaoh's household shape his later choices and character? It's interesting too, because we don't know a lot about Moses' life. We do know, like I said, he was raised there in the family there. It said there it said there in Acts. It said Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptian. It was mighty in word and deed. You know, so Moses, you know, they say that Moses was probably trained. You know, there's a possibility also too. Moses could have been in line to, according to Josephus, to be in line for the king. Now, again, that meant there was no other heirs to the throne there, but there was a possibility that he had that opportunity. We don't know for sure. But again, like I said, Joey said, you know, he was raised up. He had all the advantages of the kings, all the kings' riches. All, you know, he was basically a prince there in that kingdom there. So he had all that. And as a Hebrew, you know, it's important there that the parents still had contact with him. You know, those first few years up until he was weaned. So we don't know what the mother taught him, what was, you know, how much he could have learned at that point in time. We don't know if he went back and saw his mother and father after that. We don't have any account of that. But something we do know, and I was thinking about this, you know, probably he knew about the genocide, the infanticide that happened there. And how many other Hebrew friends did he have? And I'm not trying to be funny, but there's probably none. You know, you would think about here, Moses is in the house of the Egyptians and Pharaoh's house, knowing that all the other Egyptian boys his age, we don't know how long that lasted for, whether it was for a year, 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, or whatever. But that whole nation of the Hebrew nation there was a period of time that all those children had been killed, besides Moses. So he knew probably at that point in time how he was different than everybody else. I mean, does that make sense? I mean, I doesn't really point that out. So again, maybe Moses, I know he went back and because you wonder how he had such a faith in God, how he knew about his ancestry, how he knew what he was supposed to do. So you just wonder if he went out and, you know, I'm sure that the Egyptians, he didn't learn that, you know, Hebrew 101 or whatever. They didn't probably teach him that. So it's something that he probably had to learn on his own. Probably somebody taught him or something he researched on his own there. But, you know, or maybe he sought out. Maybe he was something, you know, taught to different people. Or maybe he had something with his parents. But there's something there with Moses that led him back to the Hebrew nation over what he, you know, because, you know, he went basically back to his roots there. And so it's interesting. We don't know how that, and again, that may come out, you know, in future lessons there. But again, you know, what was his mindset, you know, why he chose that, you know, we don't know. But again, it was, but, you know, I think he may have felt like it was his purpose to lead his nation. You know, maybe he had somewhere along his lifeline, you know, had a sign from God that he was to do that. I don't know. Right.
You were adopted in. You know, you're not really one of us, you know.
And it makes sense there too, you know. And maybe but somewhere or another, you know, he had a affinity or he had a love for the Hebrew nation, which was, you know, again, I think a lot of that too is God's plan, you know, when it boils down to it, when it's all said and done, because I guess this next question we'll finish on if we get through it. Just, in what ways does the rescue of Moses show God's providence work through human actions? I mean, it was, you know, I think this was all God's providence. Like I said, you know, first of all, like I said, all the Hebrew, young boys were thrown into the river. He was, you know, when his mother put him to the river, first of all, that was trusting in God because, I tried to read about the Nile and you know, one thing it does, it says they got hippopotamus, they got crocodiles, you know, it's not the safest area, of course. And it also too talked about when she was bathing, her people were watching. He's probably watching for the things that are in the water. I don't know, but they found the baby there. When they found, and you think about who else, if anybody else had found that Moses there, what would happen to him? He'd been killed. Yeah, more than likely because no one else had the authority to do anything with him. You know, she was one of the few people that could actually save Moses. So the only person who basically could save him was the one that found him. That's God's providence. You know, his sister watched him.
He's raised in the enemy's house.
Correct, yeah. And they basically, not only did they not know that when they were raising him up, they were raising him basically up not to that Pharaoh, but the future Pharaoh. He was to go against him and lead the people out of the land. So they were basically training Moses, you know, in that sort of building him, giving him the character there to one day come back and to do what he's supposed to do. And, you know, again, like I said, of all the places he could end up at, you know, so there's so many things that had to happen, you know, like the chain of events, you might say. And if any one of those chain of events was broken, this would have never came to fruition. But you know, there's just so many different things there that just had to happen. Again, they all sort of fell in place. And so when you read that, you realize it was God's providence most likely causing or leading him for this to happen as opposed to just coincidence. What's that? Okay, man, yeah. God has, yeah. And again, like I said, truly, once you read this lesson, the more you think about it and you study about it and look at all the things that happened, you see that Moses probably was born with a purpose. And it's just, so anyway, like I said, next week I think we'll still stay with Moses, and so there'll be some more, hopefully some more insight than I gave you this week on him, but y'all have a good week. Thank you.